This is Power 98.7. And now you're listening to Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday, taking your calls on 0861 987 000.
Welcome back. This is indeed Power Talk on Power 987. We are now turning into that discussion around Donald Trump's chaotic actions and response and entrance of the Iran-Israel conflict. I'm joined by Gideon, Chitanga, Research Associate at the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University. Welcome to Power Talk, and thanks very much, Doctor.
Very much. Just for a point of correction, I'm now at the Maximilian University of Munich in Germany.
Okay. And I'm also joined by Bilal Bassiouni, Head of Risk Forecasting at PANGEA. Welcome to Power Talk, and thanks very much for creating time.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Mbuyiseni.
And did I pronounce your name correctly?
You have pronounced it correctly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me start with you, Bilal. The current most important escalation, the actions of the United States, as it were. Can you please take us just the basis of President Trump's change of heart?
Sure. So these attacks really came at a time where U.S. position on the Israeli escalations and the preemptive attacks on Iran were quite ambiguous. The President Donald Trump oscillated between supporting those attacks when they happened and then creating deniability around initial U.S. involvement. However, the U.S. position generally changed on the following days to increase rhetoric, including also the threat of taking out Supreme Leader Khamenei in Iran. Quite an unprecedented escalation and overt threats against another country's leader. Now, this is, of course, untested territories and quite seen in diplomatic circles as rhetoric that could be quite dangerous in terms of escalation. Now, this created the grounds, at least, for further U.S. engagements dependent on the tactical opportunities that the Israeli strikes could deliver. Over the days, those opportunities and those windows opened, particularly after Israel was reasonably successful in damaging the air defense batteries around Iran and around the nuclear infrastructure. And growingly, there was a sense that the U.S. strike was going to be imminent. The scale and the degree of it was the question and concern. What we saw was quite a large and quite a technically challenging strike to carry out. However, we still do not know the damage assessments around the three main nuclear facilities that were hit: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Early conversation shows that that there is at least logistical disruptions around those sites. Iran calls it superficial at the stage. We will have to wait and see over the coming days how severe those strikes were.
The idea from even President Trump's first term of office was, he would be the first, as it were, U.S. head of state not to go to war or not to take America to war. And his point with the Iran situation was always that it must be a diplomatic solution. There must be a diplomatic solution. And these preemptive strikes by Israel are the grounds for the conclusion that he basically is servicing Netanyahu, as it were, that there's actually no American, even his own personal justification for the involvement, particularly choosing the bombing of that they have executed?
So, Dr. Mbuyiseni, Israel was quite successful in lobbying and bringing the United States into this conflict, even if we do not have direct proof that the U.S. wanted to come into this conflict from the first day. Israel has been quite successful over the particularly since October 7th, to create conditions on the ground and to draw in the U.S. into direct engagements with its adversaries or into its general calculus for the region. It does not negate the fact that the U.S. itself stands to be a beneficiary out of these airstrikes, even if the U.S. did not green-light it initially, particularly as they came at a time where the U.S. was engaged in direct negotiations with the Iranians for the first time in years, and it accused the Iranians of stalling those negotiations and not being flexible enough to reach an agreement. So these strikes would have come at a time where they could have facilitated external pressure on the Iranians to have more lenient negotiation terms. So regardless of initial U.S. position, they stand to benefit from the outcomes of initially the Israeli strikes and then the opportune moment to take up the conflict a notch up and get involved directly.
Could you expand on what those benefits are for the U.S.? Because aren't they just sort of restarting the old, or what is now considered relatively old sins of terrorism and terrorist attacks from U.S. soil itself?
And I think it's important here, Dr. Mbuyiseni, to differentiate between long-term reaping of benefits and short-term goals. And we have seen from precedent that President Donald Trump is more focused on the short-term goals, particularly around deal-making. Staying away from rhetoric around being a United States president that is not willing to drag the U.S. into conflict, these strikes, of course, stand in direct contravention of these positions and that rhetoric. Nonetheless, what it does do is give Iranians little options to maneuver, and this is precisely the position that Donald Trump would want them to be in. Now, strategically and long-term, of course, this could have adverse effects and reverse effects on the U.S., similar to what we've seen out of Iraq. There is no end game. There was no end game in Iraq, and there seems to be no end game out of the current interventions for the U.S. and Israel on Iran. For instance, the conversation around regime change in Iran has now completely shifted. The United States came out through its leadership, and particularly Marco Rubio from the State Department, who has now said regime change was never the priority or was never the end game here. However, making Iran great again. So it's just again this oscillating between the carrot and stick position around the Iranian policy, which really gives the Iranians no sense of trust on Western government's credibility in engaging in open hands and actually trying to achieve a mutually beneficial deal. So tactically, Iranians will be challenged, of course, by this position. The options to retaliate or to escalate is actually quite limited. However, they will be now thinking strategically. Is being part of the non-proliferation treaty a sensible option? Do we escalate using proxies, or do we strategically recalibrate and now push forcefully to develop a weaponized nuclear program?
Dr. Chitanga, that's precisely where I thought maybe you could take us back. This question of Iran and a nuclear weapons program has been in the propaganda strategy of Bibi for a while, the president, or rather the Netanyahu, for many, many years now, decades it would seem. And what are the official international bodies' positions on whether Iran has a nuclear weapons program or not? I mean, I'm thinking here, firstly, is there a clear-cut position from the United Nations on the one hand, but also something like the International Atomic Energy Agency?
So it's interesting that one of the controversial features of this debate is exactly what you are asking, the aspect that there is no irrefutable evidence that has been provided by the concerned agencies, including the agencies of the UN itself. And Iran is a signatory to the NPT. It submits itself to regular monitoring. But what has come out officially is the fact that there was some level of increase in uranium enrichment, but this enrichment has not reached such a level that Iran could have an atomic bomb or a weapon, or could weaponize its nuclear material. The other part of the debate escalated to when, what time, what would take Iran to reach that level. So officially, outside the propaganda that has come from Israel, and of course, we have heard U.S. authorities also starting to say that, at least in Washington, start to say that Iran was maybe a few months and weeks and so on from at least achieving or realizing the objective of having a nuclear weapon. I think that some critical scholars have compared this moment to the invasion of Iraq, and they have a point. The point being that the international community should operate on the basis of rules, and the opportunistic or ambiguity of application or use of these rules becomes very problematic. And in this case, the U.S. is likely repeating exactly the situation that happened in Iraq, where the world was told that Iraq has nuclear weapons or has a high level of enrichment of uranium that threaten global stability. And at this moment, as was in the Iraq situation, U.S. has attacked or violated the sovereignty of Iran, including attacking potentially what the Iran government says is infrastructure that it uses for civilian purposes, which is permitted by the United Nations. So outside the technicalities and the strategic tactical issues that concerns the sequencing of the attacks and the interests at play, the major challenge that we face now is how do we navigate the idea that we are living in a global normative order that is violated at will by the major powers which should be at the front of enforcing these rules. The other dimension of it, which is also critical, there is an agreed understanding that Israel itself has nuclear weapons. It's not a member of the NPT, but it's the same country that goes on to whip up emotions around the world, threatening another sovereign state, presenting claims about global threats of nuclear weapons when it's sitting secretly sitting on such weapons without really submitting itself to international law. So I would summarize this as a bit of a propaganda dance that stitches together Washington and Tel Aviv in a very dangerous situation that could potentially implode. I do not think that it is very obvious that the attacks by the U.S. to Iran are going to be a set of diplomatic leverage that will force Iran to accede to whatever the U.S. seeks to negotiate. But even if Iran was forced to accept that. The problem with coerced agreements that emerges from a maximalist context of negotiations are that a weakened power might concede without conceding, which means on paper they will say, okay, we agree with you. But then this whole program, nuclear program, then becomes so secretive. Iran decides to move away from the NPT, or even if it stays, it has already said it has no faith in the process, in the actors that are driving the process, and has implicated some of the actors with the agenda and interests from Washington and Israel. So it takes you back to the first problem that you are trying to solve. Do you make the world safe by attacking other countries, or you make the world safe by sticking to negotiations? The last point that I want to make is, outside the evidence, I think the Obama administration opened a way of engagement with Iran with the help of European partners that resulted in an agreement that Iran committed to. And it was President Trump in his first term who tore apart that agreement and said that, in his view, again with in agreement with Israel, that the U.S. and other parties were giving Iran too much money, and Iran continued on the path of its nuclear program. And there was no evidence, again, to suggest that Iran had violated those agreements.
Bilal, what is, in a way, this nuclear, or rather, let me put it this way, the nuclear facilities? It seems to me, if there was an actual advanced weapons program on the sites that they've bombed, if you're bombing a nuclear facility, the impact should be fundamentally devastating. Isn't the fact, at least even by just mere observations of what is reported, isn't already proving to us that they were not in an advanced stage of a weapons program, just based on the impact that we are looking at from reports?
So just to continue from what my colleague has raised early on, is that the intelligence community has concurred that there's no evidence that Iran has moved or has the intention to move to weaponizing its nuclear program as yet. However, there were, of course, accusations, particularly by the IEA, that Iran is no longer meeting the thresholds that were initially agreed. However, this does not, in itself, is not an indicator of weaponization as yet, or the imminence of that. Particularly also that there's consensus from the intelligence community that this was not the case. But to answer your question, Dr. Mbuyiseni, is that there was reported movement around, particularly the Fordow facility, 2 days prior to the strike, alleging that may have seen the movement of some of the enriched uranium out of the facility to an undisclosed property. Also, the IEA has mentioned that there is no increased levels of radiation around any of the facilities that have been struck, but the danger, even from a civilian use of a nuclear facility, which could be attacked, could be devastating. Particularly for Gulf countries, there's a facility on the Persian Gulf that, if radiation leaks into seawater, would have devastating environmental effects, particularly for many of these countries who use desalination for the source of water use, and besides environmental degradation that could be caused. So the threat of that is not negated at all. Increased strikes against these facilities will undoubtedly have severe environmental risks for the region.
But I mean, if you bomb a bomb, if there was that, the impact of the explosion would have been much more bigger. Is that a correct conclusion?
It is a correct conclusion, Dr. Mbuyiseni, but there is no evidence that Iran has already created or weaponized any of its nuclear facilities. There's no consensus on this, and in fact, Iran's belligerents, including Israel and the U.S., have not made that accusation.
But Bilal, I'm making a different point that
Yes.
if there was even a minimum weaponization, the bombing of that particular weaponization would have been much more devastating than we see now. The evidence that we are looking at attests to the fact that they were not weaponized.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Or the mere fact that they have not actually caused any real meaningful damage to sites that carry those enriched uranium.
So already, even these strikes, shouldn't there been already the conversation to be? But if those people were weaponizing uranium, that you have taken out those sites and the impact is that minimum, is proof to the fact that you acted on false intelligence.
The argument on the other side could be, Dr. Mbuyiseni, that we are damaging the capabilities of Iran to further enrich its uranium through damaging the facilities, the logistic networks, and the scientists that will be responsible for the technology and weaponization. Okay. So that would be the argument on the other hand. Okay. However, this in itself could be easily responded to is that the knowledge, the nuclear knowledge in the country and the infrastructure could be easily redeveloped to continue the program if that was Iran's intention.
Okay, it's 10:30 here on Power Talk. Bantwana Benkosi, if you've just joined us, this is Power Talk with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi on Power 987. We're going to take the headlines. Please stay tuned with Nyaka Lotefu.
Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, where your voice is heard and opinion matters.
We continue that conversation on the Israel-Iran conflict. I'm still online with Dr. Gideon, Chitanga, and Bilal Bassiouni. Here is an interesting clip from President Trump regarding his reaction to the question about intelligence community's findings. Let's take a quick listen.
Skeptical of a Republican administration that attacked a Middle East country on the idea of questionable intelligence of weapons of mass destruction. How is this moment different with Iran?
Well, there were no weapons of mass destruction. I never thought there were. And that was somewhat pre-nuclear. You know, there was a nuclear age, but nothing like it is today. And it looked like I'm right about the material that they've gathered already. It's a tremendous amount of material. And I think within a matter of weeks, or certainly within a matter of months, they're going to be able to have a nuclear weapon. We can't let that happen. I was very much opposed to Iraq. I said it loud and clear, but I was a civilian, but I guess I got a lot of publicity. But I was very much opposed to the Iraq war. And I actually did say, don't go in, don't go in, don't go in. But I said, if you're going to go in, keep the oil. But they didn't do that.
What intelligence do you have that Iran is building a nuclear weapon? Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
Stay informed. Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7.
That was the voice of the U.S. Head of State. Dr. Chitanga, what does this mean? Ignoring your own intelligence community on the one hand, on the other, what is at the center of the U.S.'s obsession, or rather the basis? Other people can't have weapons of mass destruction. They can't have nuclear weapons, but we have them, but others can't. What has that got to do? What is that?
Yeah, it's quite fascinating in a way to listen to President Trump make his point of view there. I think the broader political context is about the idea that the U.S. and Israel seek to recreate the politics of the Middle East in their own image, probably in a way that secures, as has been said, the security of Israel in the long term, but also the strategic interests and economic interests of the U.S. I think, given that context, whatever the U.S. intelligence would have said to President Trump, he probably made a lot of assessments, including the context of the war that is happening between Israel and Iran, and the interests and other factors, and perhaps thought that, well, the intelligence reports could be valid, but not so much a strong factor in to allow the U.S. to miss this opportunity. There is also a twist about which I think insinuates historical dimensions of this idea of addressing the problem of nuclearization. I think a lot of historians and political scientists they agree that if there is one success post Second World War success, it's this idea that for a long time major countries had managed to curtail the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and a lot of other countries really acceded to the UN in curtailing their programs, including South Africa, which is at the dawn of its democracy. It already had a nuclear program which eventually was downgraded to just civilian purposes. But I think what the US has done, President Trump has done, will effectively escalate the rush for different powers to have their own nuclear weapons as deterrence. A lot of regimes and their leaders would be looking at North Korea, for example, and thinking the U.S. cannot dare attack North Korea because for some, it's either very close or it has already made its nuclear weapons. So we are likely to see within the Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia and others which have the resources quietly move towards this direction, mainly because the U.S. has become very unpredictable. It looks quite reliable as an ally, but also in terms of sticking to its own commitments and abiding by the rules. This idea of transactionalism has introduced a dangerous trend in international relations that seems to be eating into international norms and the international systems in ways that we do not understand. I also think that related to this issue, we should mention that the violations of human rights by Israel in Gaza is creating an unprecedented situation that is almost like the Rwanda situation for those who are in Africa. I think when and if the war ends between Israel and Iran and eventually we have peace in Gaza, the world will be shocked to actually look at the mammoth loss of life. Yesterday, I watched a video where a doctor spoke about kids being shot in the head, execution style. So we are in a very fluid, fast-moving global context. To use President Trump's casual language, which is not really nice.
Bilal, your response to this, and if I may ask, what are the congressional sort of frameworks? Because there's a claim about President Trump having to have gotten Congress's consent for this attack.
Yes, so Dr. Mbuyiseni, there is growing discontent, even within the U.S. President Donald Trump's own constituency within the Republican Party about the legality of carrying out this attack without congressional support. Of course, there is precedent from previous presidents in the United States of carrying out unilateral attacks without referring back to the Congress. However, this is likely to also continue to downgrade the levels of support, given that Make America Great Again rhetoric was premised on putting American priorities and interests first, and many people would deem these strikes as in direct opposition of that mandate. And also, just to return back to the Middle East and the implications of really downgrading Iran's overall capabilities and putting it into a corner. Of course, on one hand, Iran has mostly been a very rational actor, and its responses have been quite calibrated and in line with international norms and standards, unlike what is commonly marketed around Iran. Actually, we've seen Iran in many cases be very sensible in the way it deals with such complex diplomatic issues. But at the same time, an empowered Israel, many of its current allies, particularly ones that were part of the normalization process, such as Saudi Arabia, would be wary about the potential of a unilateral or a regional power that is untested by others in the region. Of course, it gives Israel the opportunity to expand its settler project, particularly in the West Bank, and extend its posturing around Gaza and the possibility of forceful Palestinian displacement. These are issues that are likely to gain more momentum and steam once Israel deemed and its allies deem that Iran is no longer capable of posing a security threat to it. So these are issues that have far-reaching implications for countries that were also were beginning to think about the normalization process with Israel. Standing out, of course, will be Egypt and Jordan, where forced Palestinian displacement would likely target those two countries. So many countries in the region will look at these developments as a national security threat that could have various and a varied forms of destabilizing on the internal security dynamics.
What would be the perfect sort of conditions for full escalation into a world war? One of our callers actually asked earlier on what kind of a war qualifies to be called a world war? And if you could, under that definition, locate this Israel-Iran United States escalation, in what way would it escalate into a full-scale world war? Let me start with you, Bilal. Yeah.
Sure. I think that the main precursor would be a regional conflagration, which we still have not reached that stage. So it will not happen out of the blue, in my opinion. We will likely see several flags or several triggers for a regional conflagration, which draws in multipolar actors into the conflict. This has not been the case yet, particularly given Iran's calibrated responses so far. In the event, which is still a low likelihood, that Iran pushes towards closing the Strait of Hormuz, causing energy prices to soar over the $120 US mark, including carrying out widened attacks against US bases in the region. Again, these are quite low likelihood scenarios, given the sensibilities of the responses and the rationality of the responses by Iranians so far. The possibility then would increase of drawing in Chinese or Russian support, even if they were covert ones, to help draw the U.S. into a war of attrition, similar to what the U.S. has done to Russia in Ukraine. However, there is still a strong possibility for a diplomatic resolution, given the fact that a lot of other partners in the region, such as the Gulf countries, are likely doing strong back-channel diplomacy to contain this conflict. So I do not necessarily think that we are that a third world war is imminent and that the trajectory is irreversible. I believe that there is equally a strong possibility for diplomatic a return to diplomacy, given that the U.S. itself has called these attacks once off. This gives an opportunity to Iran to possibly, yes, accept quite an unfulfilling diplomatic deal, but at the same time gives it opportunity to recalibrate strategically.
Professor Chitanga?
Yes. So the textbook understanding of a world war is when you have two major powers or more engaged in a declared war. And I totally agree that we are not at a point where we will or where we are likely to see this. I also think that there isn't that appetite for a generalized conflict that will suck in major powers. So the assumption would be the U.S. with its allies, Israel and Western countries, and potentially Iran, its allies, Russia, China, and others. I don't think we're at that point. There's a lot of understanding that countries want to work towards peace. There's a lot of things that are also happening since this attack, and I think there's a lot of diplomacy. And this diplomacy goes across what we would see as axis of alliances. So Russia is involved, talking to Iran. I think the Chinese are also talking to Iran, and there's conversations that cut across Russia talking to the US and others. Europeans, especially France, has been very clear about its desire to create conditions for diplomacy. But having said that, there are other elements of these conflicts that takes a global dimension, and then brings the world factors into play, the economic factors. The economic factors, much as we have witnessed in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, although this is not a direct conflict between major powers, but the economic effects, because we are so linked in a globalized world, they affect us in South Africa in ways that are really, so you experience the increased price of fuel, increase the price of your food, inflation rises, national budgets fail to meet requirements. And I am going into these explanations because I think these are the components that should make us think seriously about the behavior of major powers. The second point is, if it so happened that the calculation of the US is that by engaging in this once-off bombing of these assets that were destroyed, then the parties go back to diplomacy and negotiate an agreement that is acceptable between the parties. It could also be a major turning point. On one end, it establishes deterrence in a very forceful way. On another hand, it emphasizes that diplomatic solutions are relevant and very important even in context of conflict. So we need time to absorb this, and I think we will be observing where this the direction which this conflict takes.
Bilal, the response of the ordinary Americans on ordinary citizens, as it were, we've seen a couple of demonstrations that seem to be starting already to put pressure against or in favor of de-escalation. What's your assessment of the United States ordinary citizenry and their response to their president, who openly act against, in this case, worse than Bush, I might add, against well-established institutions of the state that are supposed to be servicing him?
Yes, I think approval levels, approval rates for this war are likely to be very low, even with the advent of a new U.S. Donald Trump presidency, and it only being within 6 months of his new term. Still, many of his own supporters will stand strongly in opposition against this war, and we're likely to see more forceful forms of protest against any form of direct military intervention in Iran. Given that the president has declared this is a once-off operation, and we are unlikely at this stage to see a re-entry of the U.S. into these engagements, unless, of course, in a scenario where Iran expands its attacks against U.S. bases in the region. In that case, these protests are not likely to be they're likely to be short-lived. In the event the U.S. becomes more forceful and widens its scope of engagement in Iran, these protests are likely to increase. However, does not necessarily translate into policy change in the U.S. We've seen in several occasions that the U.S. has not taken the dynamics on the street into its foreign policy decision and frameworks. So they're likely to withstand those protests in a large way without conceding to it.
Dr. Gideon Chitanga and Bilal Bassiouni, thank you deeply for creating time and speaking to us about this matter, and we'll certainly hopefully have you again as it takes different turns. We're certainly monitoring that situation, but thank you deeply for joining us on Power Talk.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bantwana Benkosi, it is 1100 hours here on Power Talk, and we're going to take the news with Nyakalo Tefu.